Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. What is the one word that can turn your organization around? I'm Dwight Mahalitz. I'm the president of Effective Managers. Thank you very much for joining us. I absolutely appreciate your coming on board to this webinar and joining me in this material, which I just find absolutely exciting, and I'm just delighted to share it with you. As you know, those of you who have attended my webinars before know that I like to start off with a question. And this week, we're actually starting out with the same question that we have for the webinar title, and that is, what is the one word that can turn your organization around? I'm really looking forward to sharing that information with you. In terms of our approach today, this is a bit more fundamental webinar than we typically will have. In my first career, 25 years, I worked as a professional, a manager, an executive, and a head of organizations. And then in my second career, it's, believe it or not, 16 years now as a management consultant. I've worked with all sizes of organizations in all sectors. And the common theme, in spite of transformation projects, training initiatives, leadership retreats, new systems and processes, most of the time managers are left in a no-win situation. They're delegated too much work to do, they aren't given the resources that they need for success, and they're not given clear priorities or enough context to be able to make decisions. So at the end of the day, managers are pulled in so many different directions that they can't possibly focus on their most important work. So I launched the company Effective Managers to get to the bottom of this. I took over a year before launching the company to read all of the relevant research that I could find in terms of managerial effectiveness, accountability, frameworks within organizations. And then I joined with Professor Sui Go at the University of Ottawa, and we carried out basic research with a number of organizations and talked to real managers and surveyed real managers and analyzed that. And we developed some approaches that that really can make a difference in organizations. And we gained some absolutely amazing insights. So today I'm going to share the key elements of this with you so that you can help your managers be effective, and you will get some clues out of this as well in your own situation, how you can be more effective as a manager. So I'd like to start with the one word I'm not talking about in terms of the one word that can make a difference, and that word is empowerment. Now empowerment is critically important in organizations because we do want employees to feel that they're empowered. And by employees in this presentation, I'm really talking about managerial subordinates. So those managers that are reporting to you as a manager of managers. So too often, though, what I find in organizations is that empowerment is used as an excuse to abdicate managerial accountability and authority. So the manager says, well, I've empowered my people to do their work so they can now go away and do their work, and I don't have to be bothered with all this managerial leadership stuff. I'm exaggerating a bit to make a point, but the point is that empowerment in and of itself can't be an excuse, because if you just say empowerment and don't accompany that with anything else in terms of managerial leadership, that really leads to a situation where it's almost anarchy in the organization, where people are doing their best, there's no question about that, but they end up not being focused in on those things that are important for the advancement of the strategy in the organization. So the one word actually is accountability. And accountability is really central to ensuring that people have a clear understanding of those things for which they are accountable in the organization. Once they have that clarity, once they have that context, then it's possible for them to be empowered in terms of taking initiatives, making decisions that are consistent with the direction that the manager of the unit, you in most cases, are trying to drive the organization. So it's only when managers are setting this context and boundaries can everyone be on the same page and working towards the same goals. So the most common approach in organizations, unfortunately, is that everyone's just expected to work it out. The common sense is that I've engaged senior people; they're the best people I can find to do the job, and they can just go ahead and figure out what it is they need to do. This has consequences. and it has a significant cost. The consequences, I love this slide. I found it and I put it into this presentation. The consequences are similar to what would happen to traffic in an organization if there were no rules of the road. So it becomes an absolute traffic jam in the organization. Because if accountability isn't clear, people will take initiatives. They're paid to. They will make decisions. That's their job. But they will be doing it in isolation of their peers, in isolation of others in the organization, and sometimes, I'm sorry to say, in isolation of their managers, the people that should be using their authority to set context for them to be able to do that work. So this is a I want to give you this example. It's from science, and very often it's not very often I get to use physics as an example in these managerial programs. So if you took physics, then you know there's such a thing as the science of vectors, and vector is forces. Forces are actually additive or subtractive. So in this case, if you have a force of 1, and you add a second force of 1 that's going in exactly the same direction, then you end up with a force of 2. So those two amounts of energy pulling in exactly the same direction will combine their efforts to be able to actually move the organization forward in this case. If, on the other hand, you get a situation where vectors are working in the opposite direction, then they're subtractive. So if you have a force of 1 working in the opposite direction to another force of 1, you end up with 0. In physics, you end up with a whole bunch of heat and a whole bunch of noise, but you don't end up with any force being applied in the way which one would expect that to be applied. So what's happening in organizations, I give this example because without clear setting of accountabilities and clear delegation by managers to their subordinate managers, you end up with a situation like this. People have their own filters. They're deciding what they should do with good intent in terms of using the resources they've been delegated to do the work that they've been delegated to do. But without that clear accountability and without clear authority, what I call context and boundaries, the filters that they apply result in slightly different orientation to the decisions that are being made. So as a result, the energy in the organization is not being additive. It's not pulling the whole organization in the same way and in the same direction that it could. I'll come back to this in a bit and close the loop on that. But I wanted to make one other point first, is that the result then is kind of the playground dynamic that you have within the organization. So without the clear context being delegated by managers from the CEO right through to the front line of the organization, what happens is that nobody's really quite sure who owns the ball. So where does accountability begin and end between myself and my boss, between myself and my subordinates, between myself and peers, and myself and other parts of the organizations? So the opportunity, and to press this analogy maybe further than I should, to end up in a situation where the ball is dropped and work doesn't get done, or work is duplicated, or people are frustrated because they're not able to focus in on those things. So I'd like to give you an example. This is a live example that I came across working with an organization where we were implementing the effective point of accountability. So I won't name the organization. I do protect confidentiality, and I've changed some of the details so the organization isn't identifiable, but it's an absolutely real situation. So I've driven a mock-up of what an organization chart might look like. This actually involved three different units within the organization. So the first one here I've highlighted is finance. So finance, this director of finance reported to a CFO who reports to the CEO. We then have over on the other side of this chart a person in operations, and this operations reports to the chief operating officer who reports up to the CEO. And then we have someone in maintenance who reports up to to the head of also the head of operations up to the CEO. So this situation was intriguing as part of the implementation of the effective point of accountability. I interviewed the CEO, and I interviewed each of the first line subordinates of the CEO, so all of the vice presidents in this situation, to understand from them, what's working well in your area, what's the essence of your work, the purpose of your job, what are the key activities that you have underway. And then more to the heart of it, what are some of those things that are getting in the way of you being as effective as you can? And then always the flip-flop, what are those things that are going really well that we can reinforce that help you to be really successful in your role? And this example came up from everyone I interviewed except the CEO. And the strange thing that I found is that it had not been brought to the executive management level as an issue. So on the left, we have the director of finance, in the center, maintenance, and on the right, projects. So the project person was in the infrastructure department and was accountable for developing projects. It's a very resource-heavy, high flow-through organization. So they had a lot of intense capital expenditures, which were critical to the success of the organization. So they had in-house full-time project directors who would be given projects, and they would build facilities, bring in new equipment, whatever might be. So in this case, the project director is building a new facility. Then we have maintenance. Maintenance reports directly to the chief operating officer, and the director of maintenance is accountable for ensuring that equipment or that facility is going to run up to standard and operate effectively and just keep things moving. So those two, of course, have to work very closely together. And then finance, of course, is given accountability for overseeing the capital budget and being involved in that way. So in this particular example, what happened is that as the project was going forward and after everyone had signed off on the project, there was a fundamental change made to the nature and the positioning of the equipment in this particular facility. So it got signed off. Oh my goodness, I've changed slides here. That wasn't intended. So let me just go back. So there was a change. The project was nearing to the close before the individual in maintenance found out about the changes to the project. So got very concerned about this change in configuration because they didn't have access to the equipment as they did in the first setup. So his comment to the project director was, we can't go ahead with this. We're going to need some access through hatches in the roof to be able to get this equipment. Otherwise, every time we maintain it, we're going to have to shut down, build scaffolds, and approach it from the bottom. So that's just going to slow things down and cost a lot more money. So the project director goes to finance, and finance says, sorry, you have absolutely expended your full budget. Not possible. That's the end of the budget. So the three of them talk. They work through this. Project director says, if we try to find more money for this, we're going to have to go back to the capital budget, and we're going to have to, not be able to launch another project because all of the capital budget is fully funded and they're all on projects. So to be able to increase this one, we can't that one. So at the end of the day, the changes weren't made. So I mean, it's obvious for us sitting here listening to this example that was not the right decision. And yet from the perspective of the director of infrastructure, his job was to ensure that they came in on time, on budget, according to the specs. Director of maintenance was interested in being able to maintain it effectively, and the director of finance felt that her accountability was to ensure that projects were not overspent. So this was an example we could bring to the CEO table, sit down, talk about it, have discussion with the vice presidents, and very quickly understand that, wow, this is not the way that we would have made that decision, and understand that because the clarity of how we would work together in terms of doing our work as we move forward was not well understood, the escalation process for resolving these things was not understood. In an hour of discussion around the whole capital project's budget and process, the executive management team was able to come to decisions to clarify the delegation of accountability so that each of them understood their jobs in a better perspective. couple of other things were done as well. So it was made quite clear that finance wasn't the be all and end all in terms of budget. So they had an authority to monitor, but did not have the authority to stop projects. And the vice president of infrastructure was given some flexibility and contingency fund so that they would be able to deal with these kinds of things on the fly without having to go back to the capital budget. So 2 points to make here. One is that there's a huge amount of work that goes across organizations, and most of it works pretty well. But in those cases where it doesn't work well, it creates a huge amount of confusion. It creates role conflict. It creates situations where people who are trying to make the best decision with the information that they have available to them can't make the best decision for the organization as a whole. So the second point is that those small amounts, while they might only be say 20% or so of the overall cross-functional work, really do get in the way of doing work, and if they're addressed, they can be resolved. So back to the main event. I wanted to give you that example because I'm sure you've all experienced something along these lines, and I wanted to show you the grounding of what we're going to be talking about today. So in terms of accountability, then, one of my biggest surprises in the research we did is that there is no, until now, standard definition of accountability in organizations. So we developed one with Professor Go and I, with our reading, starting with the Oxford Dictionary and the research that we came up with this definition, that accountability is an obligation for which one can be held to account for one's results and one's actions for a specified other. So three points to bear in mind here. The first one is that there's an obligation. So I have this obligation. This is my obligation in terms of my accountability. The second is that I'm accountable for the results, certainly, but also my actions. So it's not achieve this in any way possible. It's achieve this in the appropriate way. And then the third one is this concept of a specified other. So I cannot be accountable to myself. I can only be accountable to someone else. That's someone else who can hold me to account. So what is this then about this can't be accountable to myself? I'm sure a lot of you have a question mark or a furrow in your brow right now. I make the distinction, and we make the distinction in our research, between accountability and responsibility. So responsibility is something that is self-held, it's driven by my value set, and it's something that I want to do. I'm walking down the hall in my office and there's some litter on the floor. I bend over and I pick up that litter and I throw it in the trash can because my value set is that I want to work in a nice environment, and I can help create that nice environment, so I'm going to do it. I'm not accountable for picking up that litter. There's a janitorial team that is accountable for picking up the litter and keeping the facility clean. So the differentiation here is then between accountability, that is something I can be called to account for, and responsibility, that is something which I take on by myself. Now, responsibility is really important in organizations. You know, a colleague might help somebody with a PowerPoint presentation because they're good at PowerPoint. They're not the help desk, they're not accountable for doing that, but they feel responsible to help team members do a better job. So that's great, responsibility is good. But as managers, we have to bear in mind that it's not enough. We also need to be clear about the accountability and the authority that we're delegating to our subordinates. And what did we find out in our research with the Telfer School of Management? We found out that managers are only spending 55% of their time on value-added work. So that's 45% of their time is getting caught up in some of these kinds of issues that we've been talking about, where they're going to meetings they shouldn't have to go to, they're reading email they shouldn't have to read, they're in a conflict situation with a peer in another part of the organization that they shouldn't have to be in. So if managers are losing almost half of their work week to this, what I call churn, it means that managers are not able to focus in on their value-added work. And by value-added work, I mean that work that only they, with their capability and their positions, can do. So every position, every individual in an organization has that work for which they were hired, and they're the individual that's uniquely qualified and positioned to be able to do that work. That's their value-added work. So their value-added work has three components. One is their day-to-day work and the continuous improvement of that. I call that the job description work. The second is projects or change initiatives. That's usually driven by strategy, and it's fairly bound in terms of time and resources. And then the third is their managerial leadership work. And what happens, and what I notice when I talk to managers, is because there's so much of their time taken up doing things that is not value added, the 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 piece of their work that falls off the to-do list most often is that managerial leadership work. They're not able to focus in on things like the delegation of accountability, things like setting context, things like resolving issues that have been escalated to them. So they simply aren't available to their subordinates in the way they should. And I'll give you a little challenge. Look around your organization, and if you see the individuals that have the most highly performing teams in the organization, I'll bet you dollars to donuts, a good Canadian expression, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that those are the individuals that make and create the time that they need to for their managerial leadership work to ensure that they're building and developing each individual on their team and building and developing the teamwork as they are. And I would hazard a guess, because you're in on this call, that you would tend to fit within that category, because I do find in my management consulting work that it's those individuals that are doing well, that want to do better and are looking for new ways and new methods and new information and new knowledge in terms of how they can do that. And it does make a difference. There's a research backing to my dollars to donuts bet. 70% of employees leave jobs for reasons related to factors that are directly controllable by their managers. So if managers aren't doing their managerial leadership work, they're more likely to lose their subordinate managers than if they are. And this one from Gallup, I love the Gallup information. So if you're not effectively managed, you're going to be less cost effective to the organization. And here's a great research project. It was published way back in 1994, but it's absolutely valid today. I've seen dozens of research programs that have replicated this research, and it's called the service profit chain, and it basically says that if you have satisfied employees, you're going to have satisfied customers, and satisfied customers are going to spend more with you. So you'll have more revenue and higher profit. And I mean, it just intuitively makes sense, and it's been replicated over and over again. What's happened, I've noticed though, over the last period of years, is that the value chain is stated exactly as I have. And what's forgotten is that when Heskett published this, he made a very significant statement in terms of the employee satisfaction in the organization is underpinned by the managerial leadership and management practices of the organization. So if you think about it, that again feels intuitive. Employees don't become satisfied in a vacuum. Employees are satisfied or not based to a large extent on the influence of their manager on their day-to-day work lives, as was shown on the research in the previous page. So organizations need to have systems in place to ensure that managers are doing their managerial leadership work. And part of that framework is an accountability and authority framework. You'll see in the presentation today that I refer to accountability. It's just more to save the words, but when I talk about accountability, we also have to think about authority. So accountability and authority are both necessary. So without a framework in place, the organization will start to drift. Do you remember the slide I brought up that showed you the vectors? So as the CEO approves and gets approved by the board the strategy for the organization, that sets the direction for the organization, and the CEO starts pulling the organization in that way. Unfortunately, what happens in many organizations at this point, with the approval of the strategy, the CEO says, okay, VPs, get on with it and do your work. And then again, with good intent, because of the filters that they have, there's a tendency to put the spin of your area on it, and their drift can start to set in. And as you move down the organization, the drift can get worse and worse. So the managerial leadership in the organization starts with the CEO to ensure that there's absolutely crystal clear delegation between the CEO and the VPs in terms of how we are going to work differently now, what this means to you and your role in terms of what your output will be, and starting Monday morning, what my expectations as CEO are going to be in terms of your deliverables over the next months, years, up to, could be 3, 4, 5 years out in terms of things that are being delegated, so that we can end up getting to the Pegasus vision for the organization instead of ending up with the sorry horse that you see in the bottom right-hand side of the slide. So with the framework in place, then I just put this slide up to show that we can find a way to pull the whole organization forward. And The work that we've done in this area is focused in on a document I call the effective point of accountability, and a process and a method and an approach called the effective point of accountability. So how is it that in organizations we can delegate to ensure that an individual is being delegated effectively? What we combine here is our two concepts. One is the single point of accountability. So for accountability to be successful, only one individual can be accountable for something. And the second is getting that accountability as low as possible in the organization. So you want to find that single point of accountability as low as possible in the organization. That becomes your effective point of accountability. Couple more words on accountability, and this comes back to the framework that we talked about, is that accountability does have two dimensions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in some of these slides that are upcoming. I just want to share the concepts with you. I will also be giving you access to a white paper where I go into a lot more information, depth in these areas, but I just kind of want to set the context for you. So in terms of the research that we did, felt accountability scores very high. So managers feel accountable for doing good work. That fits with my model of managers. People that are hired into jobs typically want to do well. I mean, you got the odd person that's not in a job for the right reasons, but typically they want to do well. They want to support the organization to be successful, and they want to be successful. Clarity of accountability scores much lower, almost 2 full points in our scale, so 20% lower. So managers are not clear about those things that they can be accountable for in the organization. And that's a problem because clarity of accountability leads both to clarity of action, as I've described it going down the organization, but it also leads to clarity of interaction, so how work flows across the organization. And those two things are critically important, and I'm going to address them both individually in a couple of minutes. So clarity of accountability for the work flows down the organization is actually fairly straightforward. It requires that managers do their managerial work, but as long as the CEO is doing his or her managerial work and requiring that the vice presidents do it and so on down the organization, that does happen. So if we think about it in terms of a slightly more specific way, the CEO, in looking at the implementation of the strategy, job one is to figure out what is my value added work? What are those things that I, as the CEO, need to do for us to be successful in the strategy? Once that's done, and once the CEO has his or her personal plan in place, the CEO can then sit down with each vice president and delegate to them and say, these are the things that I am holding you to account for in terms of us achieving the strategy. So this is done with each vice president. So each vice president is now developing their implementation plan, and then it's done as a group so that everybody understands what each of the others are also accountable for in terms of implementing the strategy, so that the CEO has certainty that the VPs working as a group, if they accomplish everything that they've been delegated, and add to that the value-added work of the CEO, they can achieve the strategy in the time frame of the strategy. The VP then goes on to determine their value-added work and figures out those things that they must do in terms of them being successful for the work that they need to do. And then the cycle repeats where they will do this with their directors. The directors then do that with their frontline managers. The additional piece, which we haven't talked about so much in here, is that one of the key tools that managers have is something I call context and boundaries. So setting context for the work and setting boundaries within which the work must remain. So this becomes a series of discussions between the manager and the subordinate manager in terms of things like job descriptions, planning, the strategy of the organization, policies, guidelines, processes, whatever they are. But it's the CEO giving sufficient context that the subordinate manager doesn't need to come back to ask about whatever. They merely need to know, I know what decision my manager would make if he or she were here. I can make that decision. I'm going to get on it. That's the most powerful form of empowerment that you can have in terms of people being able to get on with the work. I put this slide up. This is an excerpt from the white paper that I'll be giving access to you shortly. So it shows how the effective point of accountability changes as you move down the organization. So 2 points here. The left arrow is that as work is done higher in the organization, it's of higher complexity. So the work of the CEO might be to achieve the strategic plan, which might be 5, 7, or 10 years in the future. The work of a VP of sales in this example to meet overall sales targets might be 1 or 2 years in the future, and so on. So complexity of work moves up. The other is that on the right-hand side, the arrow is that work is delegated down the organization. And the interesting thing about the effective point of accountability is that as you delegate accountabilities to your subordinates, you don't relieve yourself of that accountability to your board. So in this situation, the CEO is accountable for achieving the bottom line. That's just a day in and day out job of the CEO. So the board doesn't say you must sell so much product this year. That might be one of the factors, but that's not what they're holding him or her directly accountable for. They're holding the CEO accountable for the bottom line. The VP of sales is delegated by the CEO their overall sales targets. In the same way the CEO would be delegating to production their overall production targets and making sure that those things match up. So if sales doesn't meet the overall targets, it becomes the CEO's accountability to resolve that so that they can achieve the bottom line. So from the point of view of the board, the CEO is the effective point of accountability for all of that stuff. But from the perspective of the CEO, it's the VP of sales that's the effective point of accountability for sales, and so on down the organization. Not to belabor that, when you read the white paper, it gives you a bit more information. Now, when we talk about work that goes across the organization, it's a whole different situation. It also requires that managers do their managerial work, but determining where that effective point of accountability is not as clear. So to help you through this, I've put together a few slides. So I've made another hypothetical organization here. The CEO is red. We've got a couple of vice presidents, a couple of directors, and a bunch of frontline managers. So the establishment of context and boundaries is still really, really important in this process, probably even more important than in direct work, but again, it's more complex. So if I'm the CEO, if I'm setting context and boundary for cross-functional work, I need to set that for the entire organization. So I'm working with VPs. An example of context, it might be the policy for human resources in the organization. So compensation, engagement, performance management, and so on. All of those things would be recommended by the Vice President of Human Resources, but it's only the CEO that has the perspective of the whole organization to balance that policy against all other kinds of policies, approaches, systems, targets, strategy of the organization to make sure that everything is congruent. Then each subordinate, as you move down the organization, has accountability to translate that context that they've received from their manager into what does it mean to us. So if I go back to the example I gave you of the infrastructure, the maintenance, and finance, what broke down there was this context, this common understanding of what the relationship is between the work of the project director of infrastructure with maintenance, the relationship of the director of finance in terms of approving or not, or monitoring or advising in terms of budgets. So here's where it gets interesting. So if we think about this process here, and process A on the bottom left of your screen, the effective point of accountability for that process is the manager, because if a decision is made to change that process, the manager is the manager of all of those people. So the manager can decide what the changes might be and can direct people to work differently. So that one's the most straightforward example. If we look at a slightly more complex process that involves two different departments, then we have a different situation. So Team Green and Team Gold collaborate on this process. Team Green, the boss of Team Green, might decide on a change in the process that's important, but can the boss of Team Green direct people on Team Gold what to do differently? No, because he's not the boss of them. And similarly, Team Gold cannot direct people on Team Green. So the effective point of accountability for process B is one level up. It's that individual who has the authority to be able to decide on changes and to be able to direct people to work differently. What happens if you have a process that work goes across the whole organization? this is where cross-functional accountability work often falls off the rails. If you have a process that goes across the entire organization, the chief executive officer, president, owner, depending on the organization, is the only individual that has the authority to decide changes to the process and to direct people to work differently. And it's not like the CEO is going down to the front line and telling this guy in the bottom here on Team Blue to do something differently. It's at that point more of a policy or a process that's been recommended up through the organization. But the point is the only person that can make the trade-off to all of these changes is in fact the CEO, because the CEO is the only individual that has that. And look at this example here, where we have a process D, which involves only 2 individuals, but in different departments. If we trace back who is the individual who has the authority to decide and direct with respect to work between those 2 individuals, again, it moves all the way up to the CEO, because that is the only individual that has the authority to decide and to direct. Now, I cannot stress this enough, that it doesn't mean that the CEO needs to be involved in every decision in the organization. As I mentioned earlier, 80% of the time these processes work well, and you can escalate these things. And in this situation between gold and blue, probably their 2 managers will be able to sit down and work it out. And because they have good context from their VPs, right, they will have that additional insight in terms of how we're going to work differently together. They'll make the agreement, and they each instruct their teams in their respective ways, and then they just get on with it. But if they can't agree, as the example I gave you, where the director of finance felt that they had the authority to stop work if the budget was extended, and the director of the project in infrastructure felt that they must be on time and on budget in all cases. If they don't have an understanding of how to escalate these up to the next level, and in fact that it's required and good practice to escalate these things so that a higher level can look at the overall process and make higher level decisions, it becomes important. So on the next slide, I show you the equivalent role for cross-functional work. Again, this is described in the white paper. You can see how work flows down the organization. Here I give the budget process as an example. So the CFO is held accountable by the CEO for the budget process. So in terms of accountability and authority, the CEO is delegating that accountability and authority to the CFO. But if the Vice President of Operations is not going to meet the budget timetable, can the CFO direct the VP of Operations to do something differently? No, they can't. The CFO might be able to approach them, try to persuade them to change, give them motivation about why they should meet the timetable. But at the end of the day, the only one that can require the Vice President of Operations to comply is the Chief Executive Officer. So it's the CEO that is the effective point of accountability. And in the white paper, I discuss how this interacts with work that flows down the organization. So anyway, the key point, this is the key point I want to leave with you. The effective point of accountability for cross-functional work is the position that can decide and direct. So if you keep that in mind, then you'll know where the person where the effective point of accountability, or I call it EPA for short, sits. And this is not the Environmental Protection Association, but it is in fact the effective point of accountability. We'll overtake them in terms of search words on Google at some point, I hope. So this is the white paper. It documents all of the information I've talked to you about in the last 15 minutes or so. And I think you'll find it intriguing. There's also a lot of information on my website around this. So I've got a link. I'm not sure if it's a hot link in your PDF. I intended to double check that. I hope it is. But if it's not, it's a fairly short one, and you can type it in. That brings you to it's the back door of my Dropbox. I don't think you'll see that, but what it does is it just downloads that document into your browser, and then you can save as to your desktop or whatever folder. So as we wind up, we've got about 20 minutes left. I'd like to change direction here a little bit and talk a bit more about what this means for you. In the promotion for the webinar, I said I wanted to give you some insight into the approach, but I also want to give you into some insight into how you might use these concepts to work a bit differently. And I think the starting point for all of us as managers is to think about accountability and authority as part of your managerial leadership role. So part of it is you're seeking clarity from your manager in terms of what has been delegated to you. And I know that you're not all in situations where you will be able to get that increased clarity from your manager. So sometimes it's your manager just isn't in that mode to be able to do that. They're in the school of let them figure it out, and that's too bad. But that's your situation. But nonetheless, you do owe it to yourself and to your team to get as much clarity as you can from your manager in terms of understanding what their plan is, what they're being held accountable for, and what that means to you and what their expectations are of you. That really helps you enormously in terms of understanding what you can delegate to your subordinates and being absolutely clear with them in terms of what they're accountable for, what the time frame is for that accountability, what the resources are that they have available for them to do that work, what the quality and the quantity of that deliverable are, so that it's clear. And the other part of the delegation, I haven't made a slide on this, but the other part to bear in mind is that delegation is very much a two-way process. It's not calling somebody in and saying, do this by such and such a date. It's sitting down with someone to work out what their accountabilities and authorities are for work that needs to be done by them in their role within certain timeframes. And you need to understand what the implications are for them in terms of their job life and what that means in terms of other deliverables that they may have. It's not up to subordinates to figure out what they should do and what they should do if they don't have enough time to do everything. It's up to the manager to give them context sufficiently that they can make the decisions in terms of what the trade-offs are about what happens when. I mentioned in my opening remarks that all managers are delegated more work than they can accomplish. The caveat is that this is fair. It's only frontline workers that are told what to do this today, and when work hard today and do this and then do this, and if you run out of work, come back and see me and I'll give you more work. So it's a job of a frontline manager for frontline people to give them the work that they can accomplish within one day if they're competent, and to give them the training to do that. But from frontline manager on up, it's part of our job as professionals and as managers to figure out the pacing of work. So of course we should have more on our plate than we can do today. It wouldn't be a reasonable job or not. But our managers do owe us enough context for us to understand the priorities in terms of how we use our judgment to do the pacing that needs to be done. The other point I wanted to make on this is that systems work better if they are organization-wide systems. So the effective point of accountability is going to work better if the CEO and the executive management team have bought in, as the example organization did that I showed you, and they start working differently, and then they require their subordinates to work differently, and so on. So it's just going to make everybody's job a lot easier, and you get that all of that vector physics working in your benefit. But if it doesn't, I mean, if the organization as a whole doesn't, you can still make great strides in terms of using your managerial leadership authority in terms of doing your work with your subordinate managers to do the best you can. So I put this last bullet, don't let the horrible boss who's broken the chain, I think of it as breaking the chain. If somebody doesn't do their managerial work between the CEO and the front line, that person that has not done that work has broken the chain of delegation from the CEO down to the front line, and there are going to be problems. There's just no two things about it. So if you're one of those people that's below that break in the chain, you have to figure out other mechanisms and workarounds to be able to get that work done. So key elements then for success in the organization. One is we need to establish a common language, which I put here roles of the road, but it's rules of the road. Identify the rub points, the 80-20 rule. So 80% of work does work well, 20% probably is causing some issues, and there's probably some smaller amount of that that's causing the greatest amount of problem. So let's find that 5 or 10 or 15% where the biggest problems are and the most role conflict is occurring, and if we could solve this, boy, life would be better for everybody problems, and focus in on those. and you need to figure out how to talk about the elephant on the table. So often those discussions just do not take place. The example I gave you from my client organization, that situation did not get to the table. When it did get to the table, the CEO made the decision, and not everybody was happy because finance ended up in what we call a monitoring role, not a stop work kind of a oversight role. But they understood the trade-offs and they understood their authorities, and all of them agreed, yeah, this is great. Now we have the context to be able to move forward. The effective point of accountability has to make decisions and has to be aware that they are the effective point of accountability and do have to make those decisions. And then once the decisions are made for changes and improvements, then they become part of the context for the rollout. So as in my example, once the executive management team made the decision and the new context was set by the CEO, then each VP needs to reset that context with their directors. Each director needs to do it with their frontline people and so on. An example I would give the latest issue of Business Magazine has this amazing article on Target, and they call it the last days of Target, and they call it the incredibly stupid inside story. But if you look at it, it's just rife with the elephants in the room. So a decision was made at the top. They acquired the real estate, and once the real estate was acquired, everybody had to get on board and had to meet insane deadlines because they're going to start paying, well, they were paying lease fees for all of this real estate, and therefore the stores needed to be a success. So it's a very interesting read, but it just shows that, you know, incredibly successful companies can be suffer the same kinds of problems that smaller organizations do, in terms of do subordinates feel that they have the authority to escalate issues when they see real problems on the table? And do they have the confidence that if they raise an issue with their boss, that it's going to be taken seriously and that they will be able to work through the resolution? Whether they could have been successful with the expansion in Canada or not within that time frame is open to question. But we know the real story, and in fact, they took a very, very major loss in over $10 billion in about $10 billion. I can't remember. It was just over or just under. So sneak peek time. What I want to do is just give you a bit of a peek into the accountability and authority framework that I do use with my client organizations. This has not been published anywhere to point. I am working on a book, and it will be published in the book. And for those of you participating in this workshop, I just did want to give you an insight. So this is where we talk about the common language and how incredibly important that common language is. So for the accountability of a manager, that's summarized by the 5 requirements of effective managers. So effective managers have to plan, they have to do their value-added work, they have to set context and boundaries, they have to delegate, and they're accountable for the output of their team, and they have to establish feedback loops. I do have a paper on the 5 requirements on the website. Download it if you're interested. But you have to have the authorities that go with that. I'm not going to dive into this here, but just to give you this sense that then when you're talking in the organization about planning, you know that each manager is accountable for planning within the context of their organization and as a subset of their manager's plan. And in order for them to be able to do that, they have this authority that goes along with that. So the delegate one, I like this. The delegate is accountability is to delegate, and you're accountable for the output of the team. So if I'm accountable for the output of my team, I need the authority to be able to delegate work to my people. I need the authority to be able to delegate resources to them. And I need the authority to be able to veto the appointment of direct reports. So the organization can't foist a troublemaker, ne'er-do-well kind of individual on me simply because there's nowhere else to put that person. I would have the authority to veto. I might not have the authority to hire anyone I want because I am part of a larger organization, but we need to be clear about these things. So then throughout the organization, we have this common language about what delegating work is like. It's more complex, much more complex when we go across the organization, but I wanted to give you an insight in that because it can be thought of simply. And I want to give a shout out here to Elliot Jacks, who first really started writing about cross-functional authority and accountability and authority frameworks in requisite organization. And he's got a system which I have implemented in large Canadian, and I think some international organizations as well in terms of how we do this work. But it's a fairly complex and fairly difficult to implement. It takes pretty much a year of solid activity. I mean, it's great, but it is absolutely the Cadillac version of work. And then Jerry Cranes, he's a professor at Harvard and also wrote a book here called The Accountability Leadership. And he took a crack at simplifying Elliot's work, and this is my take on it, working with client organizations and some people I respect very much in the HR field to take it down a notch, so that we've got the power of the language of the cross-functional work, but after the implementation of it into the organization, it's simple enough that a manager can sense that it feels intuitive to them. So it's not like learning a new language as much as it is nuancing our current languages and coming up with standard definitions. So we just come up with three categories: informing, persuading, and instructing. So effectively what we did in the example I gave you, we moved finance from what they thought was an instructing authority and moved them up into a persuading authority. So certainly they had the authority to monitor the expenditure of funds, and with that authority they can use their judgment with respect to the work of others, persuade them to change behavior if work is outside or approaching defined limits. And if they're not happy with the results, then they're required to escalate that work. So what it does is it gives finance a very legitimate means of monitoring against budgets, but doesn't give them the authority to say to someone in infrastructure, you can't spend any more money, because that is beyond the authority in terms of the way that they want to work moving forward. So in terms of these informing, persuading, instructing, you can describe work that flows across the organization. You can break it down into the specific accountabilities of advising or recommending under informing, of coordinating or monitoring under persuading, and of stopping or directing under instructing, so that stopping or directing under instructing, so that in terms of that common language, if finance is delegated monitoring authority, then everybody else in the organization knows what that means, both in terms of what finance has the accountability to do, but also the authority to do. In terms of the implementation of the system, there is an approach, and this is it's a cascading approach in organizations. It's pretty standard. The CEO sits down with the vice presidents at the executive management team, and they have the discussions. And I think I've given you enough examples that you understand what that discussion might be. It's the elephant in the room in terms of how work flows across the organization. Each vice president then sits down with all of their directors as a team, and then each individually, to reset context based on those meetings and to delegate clearly in terms of accountability and authority for work moving forward. That then moves down to the next level, where directors do that work with the frontline managers and the professionals. If it's a larger organization where you have a senior vice president or an executive vice president roles, then there are more cascades. It's more complex, but the principles are the same. Now here's the twist, and here's where I find the real added value to organizations in terms of people like myself who are management consultants. If you have an external consultant come in to do the facilitation at the executive management team level, that person is far better suited to put the elephants on the table and to ensure that the discussions are taken than somebody that's sitting at the table as a member. Certainly, in the example I gave you, there was an understanding that things were not working well in the capital process, but some of the main issues, for whatever reason, were not being put on the table. You know, people want to do well, they want to be successful, they have this high felt accountability to do well, and often bringing the issue to the executive management team level, or even on the side to the CEO, is almost like an admission of, I wasn't able to do my job and now I need to come to you for help. At the end of this meeting, the CEO of this particular team made a great statement. He says, my first priority amongst all of you, and my first preference, would be that if two of you have a disagreement, the two of you can work it out and just get on with it. He says, that's my absolute first hope for you. He says, but if the two of you can't agree, then don't waste time and energy trying to resolve something that's not resolvable from each of you. Come and sit down and let's work it out, and I'll make a decision, and then we can get on with the work and work within that new context. And I thought that was just stated so well. So anyway, the external consultant, by meeting with and interviewing each of these team members, can find that 20% that's causing the rubs and the hot spots in the organization, develop an agenda, facilitate that discussion, and move it forward. Then in the next round, an internal team can actually do that facilitation, but with training from the external consultant. So based on the agenda from the CEO and the VPs, that internal team facilitation with each VP and their directors can be carried out, and in 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever of the sessions, the external consultant can provide training, oversight, guidance, coaching, so that you have an internal team that's qualified to do that work. And then in the final round and final rounds, if it's a larger organization, the internal team can do that and carry it on. So the internal team does have that authority and that ability to raise the difficult questions lower in the organization. It tends to be at the executive management team level where it gets more difficult. So a couple of final points that I want to make is that as organizations grow in size and complexity, systems are needed. The first thing in that is to understand what the current state of the organization is. So if you really want to make a significant and impactful change to the organization, you have to know what the current state of the organization is. And if you think of current state analyses, we have great tools in place for all of these kinds of things that you see coming up on your screen now. So if you're starting a new strategy, you know what you need in financing, you know what you need in funding, infrastructure, supply chain, all of those kinds of things. But you don't have a tool, and typically don't have a very good understanding about what the state is of your managerial workforce. So the survey form that Sui Go and I prepared for the research that we did with the Telfer School of Management has been used to create a survey form which combined with interviews can create an extremely strong tool for you to understand the current state of effectiveness in your organization. And that results in a report which is presented to the executive management team, and then the management consultant coordinating and doing this work actually sits down with the executive management team, gives them the results, ensures they understand it, and facilitates a discussion in terms of how work can be done moving forward. So by having that discussion and that report, then there's real information put on the table in terms of what are the things that we can do in this organization that can make a change for how we will work differently moving forward, and create situations in our organizations where managers can be more effective and get focused in on implementing strategy from their perspective, and really help this organization work better as we move forward. Because it really is, at the end of the day, it is all about work. It's what is the work in the organization? How do we work together as a team? How do we work better? How do we work more effectively? So that all of us working in a coordinated way, in a concerted way, with the right context, will be able to do that. We'll be able to do that. So in closing, I've got just a few slides in terms of resources that are available for you. One is my book, The Effective CEO, where I talk about the 6 key functions that a CEO needs to have in place for driving sustainable performance. For you on the call letter, heads of organizations, this will be of direct interest to you. Those of you that are more senior executives or heads of HR or senior people in HR would be interested in this perspective, because HR has one of the key roles with most of these systems and can be an advisor to CEO. And those of you that are aspiring to take more senior executive roles or to run your own organization, I think you'll find some great information in there that you'd be interested in. I promised you extra resources, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew where to go. So if you look at the Effective Managers website, we do have a resources page. You can click there for different views if you're a manager, a CEO, or head of HR. And there are different papers that you can download. We do ask for your email address and organization, because I'm curious in terms of who is downloading this information. That gets you on my email list, but if you find that the e-newsletter is not helpful, then by all means unsubscribe. My feelings aren't hurt, I promise you. But I get really good feedback in terms of the e-newsletter with hints for managers in terms of how they can manage differently. On my website, you see on the right, there's also a place where you can subscribe to the newsletter. So those of you that registered for the webinar will get the next edition of the newsletter, and you can judge for yourself. Check out YouTube. This webinar will soon be posted on my YouTube channel, and there's over 40, I think it's almost 50 now, different webinars and videos. One video that I've had a lot of good feedback on is "Are you a leader or a manager?" It's a 17-minute excerpt from a workshop I did with the EMBA alumni at Telfer School of Management. Are you a leader or a manager? Check it out. I think you'll have fun. And finally, just to let you know that I would love to be in longer-term contract with you. So feel free to follow me on Twitter, where if you want to get some day-to-day management tips. And if we're not connected on LinkedIn, let's connect. I find that just a great way to keep in touch, and I love to answer any questions that anyone might have. So that brings us to the end. It looks like I went 1 minute over. I apologize. Looks like I delegated myself too much work to do, but I really enjoyed working through this. It's presented the material in a different way than I have up until now. And oh, thank you for the thanks that I'm getting coming up on the questions. There are no specific questions that have come up. When you exit from the webinar, there will be a short survey will pop up. It's only 3 questions long. I would really appreciate your taking a minute to answer those questions. And if you have any questions for me that you think of, put them in the survey form, and I'll get back to you by email. And if you'd like to have a discussion on any of these things, also please let me know in the feedback form, and I will be back to you. So I will then bring this to a close. I thank you very much for your attention. I really enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful. I look forward to your feedback in terms of how we can improve these going forward. And if you have any questions about how these things might apply in your situation, I would be just absolutely delighted to talk with you. So have a great rest of the day wherever in the world you are. Take care. Bye.
Hi, I'm Dwight Mahalitz, President of Effective Managers. Thank you so much for downloading the webinar. I hope that you enjoyed it and will find it useful. Feel free to check out other parts of the website for interesting downloads. Most are free, some are at a nominal charge, but I'm sure you'll find lots of interesting tools there and things that can help you be more effective. And in fact, that's what my job is. My job is to help you, help your organization be higher performing. The bottom line is that I want to start where you are, understand your problem, and provide services that can help you solve that problem and implement a solution as quickly and as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Give me a call, drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you, talk about your situation, and see if there's anything that we can do together. Thank you.